24. The ambassador said, "He's with the secret police." Then why is he so open about it? What good is a secret police that can't keep its secrets? The ambassador positioned himself on the cot by folding his legs under his body as he had learned to do in a yoga class. Kennedy, beaming down on him from the frame on the wall, gave his words a special consecration. "The secret police have several functions, my dear," he began in an avuncular tone. "The first is the classical one. They keep an ear out for what people are saying and report it to their superiors. The second function is intimidatory. They want to make it seem as if they have us in their power. They want us to be afraid. That is what your bald-headed friend was after. The third function consists of staging situations that will compromise us. Gone are the days when they tried to accuse us of plotting the downfall of the state. That would only increase our popularity. Now they slip hashish in our pockets or claim we've raped a 12-year-old girl. They can always dig up some girl to back them." The engineer immediately popped back into Teresa's mind. Why had he never come? "They need to trap people," the ambassador went on, "to force them to collaborate and set other traps for other people, so that gradually they can turn the whole nation into a single organization of informers." Teresa could think of nothing but the possibility that the engineer had been sent by the police. And who was that strange boy who drank himself silly and told her he loved her? It was because of him that the bald police spy had launched into her and the engineer stood up for her. So all three had been playing parts in a pre-arranged scenario meant to soften her up for the seduction. How could she have missed it? The flat was so odd, and he didn't belong there at all. Why would an elegantly dressed engineer live in a miserable place like that? Was he an engineer? And if so, how many engineers read Sophocles? No, that was no engineer's library. The whole place had more the flavor of a flat confiscated from a poor imprisoned intellectual. Her father was put in prison when she was 10, and the state had confiscated their flat and all her father's books. Who knows to what use the flat had been put? Now she saw clearly why the engineer had never returned. He had accomplished his mission. What mission? The drunken undercover agent had inadvertently given it away when he said, "Just remember that prostitution is a criminal offense." Now that self-styled engineer would testify that she had slept with him and demanded to be paid. They would threaten to blow it up into a scandal unless she agreed to report on the people who got drunk in her bar. "Don't worry," the ambassador comforted her. "Your story doesn't sound the least bit dangerous." "I suppose it doesn't," she said in a tight voice as she walked out into the Prague night with Karenin. 25. People usually come from their troubles into the future. They draw an imaginary line across the path of time, a line beyond which their current troubles will cease to exist. But Teresa saw no such line in her future. Only looking back could bring her consolation. It was Sunday again. They got into the car and drove far beyond the limits of Prague. Tomasz was at the wheel, Teresa next to him, and Karenin in the back, occasionally leaning over to lick their ears. After 2 hours, they came to a small town known for its spa where they had been for several days 6 years earlier. They went to spend the night there. They pulled into the square and got out of the car. Nothing had changed. They stood facing the hotel they had stayed at. The same old linden trees rose up before it. Off to the left ran an old wooden colonnade culminating in a stream spouting its medicinal water into a marble bowl. People were bending over it, the same small glasses in hand. When Tomasz looked back at the hotel, he noticed that something had, in fact, changed. What had once been the Grand now bore the name Baikal. He looked at the street sign on the corner of the building, Moscow Square. Then they took a walk. Kiernan tagged along on his own, without a leash, through all the streets they had known and examined all their names. Stalingrad Street, Leningrad Street, Rostov Street, Novosibirsk Street, Kiev Street, Odessa Street. There was a Tchaikovsky Sanatorium, a Tolstoy Sanatorium, a Rimsky-Korsakov Sanatorium. There was a Hotel Suvorov, a Gorky Cinema, and a Cafe Pushkin. All the names were taken from Russian geography, from Russian history. Teresa suddenly recalled the first days of the invasion. People in every city and town had pulled down the street signposts that had disappeared. Overnight, the country had become nameless. For 7 days, Russian troops wandered the countryside, not knowing where they were. The officers searched for newspaper offices, for television and radio stations to occupy, but could not find them. Whenever they asked, they would either get a shrug of the shoulders or false names and directions. Hindsight now made that anonymity seem quite dangerous to the country. The streets and buildings could no longer return to their original names. As a result, a Czech spa had suddenly metamorphosed into a miniature imaginary Russia, and the past that Teresa had gone there to find had turned out to be confiscated. It would be impossible for them to spend the night. 26. They started back to the car in silence. She was thinking about how all the things and people seemed to go about in disguise. An old Czech town was covered with Russian names. Czechs taking pictures of the invasion had unconsciously worked for the secret police. The man who sent her to die had worn a mask of Tomasz's face over his own. The spy played the part of an engineer, and the engineer tried to play the part of a man from Petrin. The emblem of the book in his flat proved a sham designed to lead her astray. Recalling the book she had held in her hands there, she had a sudden flash of insight that made her cheeks burn red. What had been the sequence of events? The engineer announced he would bring in some coffee. She walked over to the bookshelves and took down Sophocles' Oedipus. Then the engineer came back, but without the coffee. Again and again she returned to that situation. How long was he away when he went for the coffee? Surely a minute the least, maybe 2 or even 3. And what had he been up to for so long in that miniature anteroom? Or had he gone to the toilet? She tried to remember hearing the door shut or the water flush. No, she was positive she'd heard no water. She would have remembered that. And she was almost certain the door hadn't closed. What had he been up to in that anteroom? It was only too clear. If they meant to trap her, they would need more than the engineer's testimony. They would need incontrovertible evidence. In the course of his suspiciously long absence, the engineer could only have been setting up a movie camera in the anteroom. Or more likely he had let in someone with a still camera who had photographed them from behind the curtain. Only a few weeks earlier she had scoffed at Prochaska for failing to see that he lived in a concentration camp, where privacy ceased to exist. But what about her? By getting out from under her mother's roof, she thought in all innocence that she had once and for all become master of her privacy. But no. Her mother's roof stretched over the whole world and would never let her be. Teresa would never escape her. As they walked down the garden-lined steps leading back to the square, Tomasz asked her, "What's wrong?" Before she could respond, someone called out a greeting to Tomasz. 27. He was a man of about 50 with a weather-beaten face, a farm worker whom Tomasz had once operated on and who was sent to the spa once a year for treatment. He invited Tomasz and Teresa to have a glass of wine with him. Since the law prohibited dogs from entering public places, Teresa took Karen back to the car while the men found a table at a nearby cafe. When she came up to them, the man was saying, "We live a quiet life. 2 years ago, they even elected me chairman of the collective." "Congratulations," said Tomasz. "You know how it is. People are dying to move to the city. The big shots. They're happy when somebody wants to stay put. They can't fire us from our jobs." "It would be ideal for us," said Teresa. "You'd be bored to tears, ma'am. There's nothing to do there. Nothing at all." Teresa looked into the farm worker's weather-beaten face. She found him very kind. For the first time in ages, she had found someone kind. An image of life in the country arose before her eyes. A village with a belfry, fields, woods, a rabbit scampering along a furrow, a hunter with a green cap. She had never lived in the country. Her image of it came entirely from what she had heard, or read, or received unconsciously from distant ancestors, and yet it lived within her as plain and clear as the dagger type of her great-grandmother in the family album. "Does it give you any trouble?" Tomasz asked. The farmer pointed to the area at the back of the neck where the brain is connected to the spinal cord. "I still have pains there from time to time." Without getting out of his seat, Tomasz palpated the spot and put his former patient through a brief examination. "I no longer have the right to prescribe drugs," he said after he had finished. "But tell the doctor taking care of you now that you talk to me and I recommend you use this." And tearing a sheet of paper from the pad in his wallet, he wrote out the name of the medicine in large letters. 28. They started back to Prague. All the way Teresa brooded about the photograph showing her naked body embracing the engineer. She tried to console herself with the thought that even if the picture did exist, Tomasz would never see it. The only value it had for them was as a blackmailing device. It would lose that value the moment they sent it to Tomasz. But what if the police decided somewhere along the way that they couldn't use her? Then the picture would become a mere plaything in their hands and nothing would prevent them from slipping it in an envelope and sending it off to Tomasz, just for the fun of it. What would happen if Tomasz were to receive such a picture? Would he throw her out? Perhaps not. Probably not. But the fragile edifice of their love would certainly come tumbling down, for that edifice rested on the single column of her fidelity, and loves are like empires. When the idea they are founded on crumbles, they too fade away. And now she had an image before her eyes, a rabbit scampering along a furrow, a hunter with a green cap, and the belfry of a village church rising up over the woods. She wanted to tell Tomasz that they should leave Prague, leave the children who bury crows alive in the ground, leave the police spies, leave the young women armed with umbrellas. She wanted to tell him that they should move to the country, that it was their only path to salvation. She turned to him, but Tomasz did not respond. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. Having thus failed to scale the fence of silence between them, she lost all courage to speak. She felt as she had felt when walking down Petrin Hill. Her stomach was in knots, and she thought she was going to be sick. She was afraid of Tomasz. He was too strong for her. She was too weak. He gave her commands that she could not understand. She tried to carry them out but did not know how. She wanted to go back to Patrin Hill and ask the man with the rifle to wind the blindfold around her eyes and let her lean against the trunk of the chestnut tree. She wanted to die. 29. Waking up, she realized she was at home. She went outside and set off in the direction of the embankment. She wanted to see the Vltava. She wanted to stand on its banks and look long and hard into its waters because the sight of the flow was soothing and healing. The river flowed from century to century, and human affairs play themselves out on its banks, play themselves out to be forgotten the next day, while the river flows on. Leaning against the balustrade, she peered into the water. She was on the outskirts of Prague, and the Vltava had already flowed through the city, leaving behind the glory of the castles and churches. Like an actress after a performance, it was tired and contemplative. It flowed on between its dirty banks, bounded by walls and fences that themselves bounded factories and abandoned playgrounds. She was staring at the water. It seemed sadder and darker here, when suddenly she spied a strange object in the middle of the river, something red. Yes, it was a bench, a wooden bench on iron legs, the kind Prague's parks bound in. It was floating down the Vltava, followed by another, and another, and another, and only then did Teresa realize that all the park benches of Prague were floating downstream, away from the city, many, many benches, more and more, drifting by like the autumn leaves that the water carries off from the woods, red, yellow, blue. She turned and looked behind her as if to ask the passers-by what it meant. Why are Prague's park benches floating downstream? But everyone passed her by, indifferent, for little did they care that a river flowed from century to century through their ephemeral city. Again, she looked down at the river. She was grief-stricken. She understood what she saw was a farewell. When most of the benches had vanished from sight, a few latecomers appeared, one more yellow one, and then another, blue the last.